Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to come and speak with you today on discussing some of the aspects of federal investments in research that we have. It's a topical discussion that we have as budgets are being announced and new programs are always unrolled, and it's nice to be able to be here and talk a little bit about where we're going and where we've been. So my talk today I've divided into 5 main areas. One is to talk a little bit about the drivers or an environmental scan that's influencing the research we do and the outcomes we hope to achieve. Talk a little bit about Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We've been in existence since 1886, and many changes have happened over those 126 years, so just talk a little bit of how the focus of research has changed over time. Talk a little bit with some examples on levels of investment that we have in certain areas of research. Talk a bit about models that we are currently using or plan to use to deliver results, and then a little bit on future opportunities. So if we look at the drivers or the challenges that producers are facing nowadays, you don't have to look too far and wide to see some of the issues that are out there. Just back in October, for example, we had the serious outbreak of E. coli, which had an impact on beef production here in Alberta. And you can go into any website of any newspaper and pull out all sorts of reasons why it happened. But the net result is that there was an impact, and there is a need for us to conduct research in that particular area to avoid food quality and safety issues that are being faced by Canadians. We also have challenges on the cropping front, where we look at biotic stresses that you face every day as producers. It could be things like Fusarium head blight, where the toxins are changing, and we need to understand how that's happening. We have issues with stripe rust, particularly in the Lethbridge area. We're seeing more incidents of the disease as time goes on. There's also a worldwide threat called UG99, which is a particularly virulent strain of stripe rust that was initially detected in Uganda and is now beginning to spread throughout the world. And the expectation is that it will arrive in North America at some time soon. And it's so devastating that we have to be ready in order to protect our wheat crop in particular. Another particular challenge that's being faced is the wheat midge, which is one that reduces yield on a consistent basis. There's also the future challenges that we're facing in terms of global changes in terms of the climate, population growth. There's no secret that there is an increasing demand for food, and estimates are by 2030 there'll be 8 billion people that will require food. And because they're increasing in their affluence, they're also eating differently, and so the demand for calories is also expected to rise over time. If you look at the amount of arable land that we have around the world, it's decreasing, and as the population grows, of course, the arable hectares per capita begins to decrease, and that puts pressures on producing food. And so whereas today a hectare of land feeds around 4 people, over time the expectation is it's going to have to feed 5 people. The demand for food will be estimated to be 80% bigger by the year 2050, and those are FAO estimates. And also there's the demand to divert some of the crop from food to non-food uses. And so as the bioeconomy continues to grow, there will be some diversion of food crops to the non-food sector. In terms of research, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has the mandate and the vision to be a leader in food and non-food research and also in innovation. And that's not only in research, it involves the provision of information, the development of research and technology, and the delivery of programs that are all intended to ensure that the sector is competitive and remains innovative. We have a network of sites across Canada. There's 19 in total, and these sites are all linked either with domestic collaborators or with international partners to help us deliver on our mandate. The research we do is essentially divided into 4 areas. We provide research that helps to satisfy policy and regulatory advice. So we come up with science-based rules when decisions are announced. We have a mandate to look at food safety to ensure that there's safer practices and processes, and also to some degree the detection systems. And here there is a bit of overlap with what Health Canada would do, but Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada does play an important role. We do spend a considerable amount of our research activity in the development of sustainable crop and livestock production systems, and the research that Brian Barris provided to you just before me is an example of the research that's underway. And finally, we look at deriving economic benefits in production and in processing systems, and this is not done alone, it's done in collaboration with other organizations. All of the research that we do within Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada falls under three main pillars. It's either science and innovation, competitiveness, or environmental sustainability. And we have 7 research priorities that all of our research falls under. The two that are the two main pillars that occupy most of the efforts that we do are under science and innovation, where we look at economic benefits to producers, that would be production systems, and also under environmental sustainability, where we look at best management practices and trying to further understand how agricultural practices are being influenced by climate change. As I mentioned, we have 19 research centers across the country, and this graphic indicates where the main sites are, but in addition to those 19 centers, we also have 33 other smaller sites that are located throughout all the producing areas in Canada. We have about 30,000 hectares of land that we use for our research, and we have 450 scientists and research professionals located at those 19 centers across the country. Our annual budget is about $200 million a year, and this budget actually has remained relatively stable for about the past 10 years. So I mentioned I was going to chat a little bit about agriculture then and now. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada came into existence in 1886, and we just celebrated our 125th anniversary in 2011. If we look at the research that we were doing back when the 5 original research centers were established, and those 5 were, I'm going to test my memory here, in Nepean, Nova Scotia, in Ottawa, in Brandon, Manitoba, Indian Head, Saskatchewan, and Agassiz in BC. Those were the original 5, and then from there the centers have grown. The research conducted at that time was relatively simple. It was more or less to demonstrate what crops or what husbandry practices could be used in a particular region. And so the focus of the research was primarily in technology transfer. The programs themselves were pretty well independent. They were, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada was essentially self-contained and designed to provide all of the answers in-house, and the infrastructure that it had associated with those programs, again, were there and had the capability of delivering all the results. And exclusively, there was a budget that was awarded by Parliament that would allow research to continue. If you look at the way agriculture has grown, the questions that are being asked and the experimental designs needed to answer those questions are far more complex. And by far more complex means we need more people and we need more money to find those results. We do research now, what we call along the innovation continuum. That's right from basic research to the delivery of the results to producers who can take it and use it. We no longer have independent research programs. We tend to stress a collaborative research program. And the reason for that is because of the complexity of the questions and the expertise that's required to conduct those results. You have to interact with other organizations in order to deliver on those results. We don't have standalone facilities anymore. We have mostly virtual, or we're moving towards more virtual organizations. 2 examples I can give you is we, as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, have 2 scientists working on beef genomics. They're based at the University of Alberta. They're right on campus, and as students walk down the hall, it's virtually impossible for them to know whether the person is employed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada or employed by the University of Alberta. But this is our contribution to further our understanding of beef genomics. And those 2 scientists do work in collaborations with the other scientists or other professors at the University of Alberta, as well as other collaborating organizations. Another example is the province just hired a new bee specialist, Shelley Hoover. She's based in Lethbridge. She's actually located on the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada side. She has her own office, her own lab on the federal side. And again, it's just an example of how we're going to a more virtual organization. Whereas our budgets used to be essentially all derived from Parliament, we're now pursuing partnerships. We now have a portfolio of funding. There's various programs that are out there. Growing Forward is a program that's coming to an end as of March of 2013. The expectation is that the Growing Forward 2 will be announced very shortly, but there's opportunities for federal money to be used not only by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, but by other organizations as well, and that includes stakeholders as well as universities in the private sector. In addition, we do enter into collaborative agreements with our partners, and so money does flow into Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as well. This is a shot of the Lethbridge Research Centre. I like to say it's the largest one we have in Canada because I happen to be the director of that station, but in reality it's the second largest. So I say we're number 2, but we try harder. If you look at the facility we have here now, it's quite a new, modern facility. It has quite a few unique attributes to it. And when you think back of when the station was established in 1906, it didn't look anything like that. And so the organization and the institution grows as it needs to meet the demands of the day. Lethbridge was established in 1906, and essentially it was put in place to help growers, producers deal with the issues that they were facing, things like a short growing season, lack of moisture. I don't know where they would come up with high winds. That doesn't sound like Lethbridge to me. Different soil types and a lack of crop varieties that were in the area. It was selected because there was a possibility to look at it under irrigation and dryland conditions, and there was the successful sugar industry at the time. In terms of the complex now, it's a fairly large complex. It's about 2,300 meters squared in terms of our offices and our labs. We have 56 scientists currently there with a total staff of 350 employees. We have expanded to include more collaboration with universities, so we have about 50 or 60 postdoctoral fellows that come to work at our center for a 2 to 3 year time frame. We have quite a few graduate students and quite a few visitors from around the world that come and visit our site. We have about 520 hectares of field trials, land for field trials and long-term plots. As you're driving down the Jail Road, for example, heading eastbound, you'll notice there's some wheat land there. And those particular plots have been in rotation for 101 years. And we've collected soil samples every year since that study started. And no one knew that when climate change would become more of an issue, would we have that resource to go back and look at those soil samples to see how conditions have changed over the last 101 years. We also have a very active livestock program. There's a feed mill, 1,000-head feedlot that has a grow-safe system. We have a controlled environment building where we can look at animals on a more close basis. We're the only institution in Canada that has the insect microbial containment facility, so we can bring in biological control agents to manage rangeland weeds and reduce the need for any herbicide applications. We have 3 substations, one in the deep south at 1-4, which has about 17,000 hectares of grass prairie. That's also the site where we maintain our herd of about 500 animals. Staveley is about 400 hectares of rough fescue range, where we look at long-term pasture management. And Vauxhall, we have 200 hectares of irrigated land, where we look at many of the crops, including potatoes. In terms of our programs, we have a national mandate, as all of our centers do, as well as a regional mandate. So in terms of national, we have a beef program that addresses all of the areas that you see here on the slide. We also have the national mandate for the biological control of rangeland weeds. As I mentioned, we have a facility to bring in these biological control agents, different insects that are known to feed specifically on certain weeds and no other plant. And those have been released and have shown pretty good success. Regionally, we have a good breeding program where we're looking at things like soft white wheats, winter wheats, triticales, beans, forages, bio-industrial crops. We've just hired a new scientist to look at perennial cereals for the bioeconomy. We also have an active group working on that conducts potato work. We don't have the breeding program in Lethbridge, but we are a site for the breeding program. Regionally, we also look at environmental impacts of agriculture in terms of manure management, water, climate, looking at climate change, and also soil quality. We look at crops. These are the crops that we've listed here. We've had some good success with soft white winter wheats. 8 varieties in total have been released. mostly for the pastry and cookie industry, but some of the varieties that we've brought forward is showing great promise in the bioethanol area. Very strong winter wheat program. We have a good bean program. Potatoes are an important crop for us. We also have an agronomy program, as Brian alluded to. Weed science, I believe Bob Blackshaw spoke to you yesterday. And we also have a strong entomology program as well. In environment, we look at things like manure management, long-term rotations, carbon sequestration. A lot of activity was undertaken in terms of conservation tillage, and we still look at that. Rangeland and pasture management is an important area, as looking at the impacts of various production systems on soil, air, and water quality. Beef occupies about a third of our effort at the research center, and again, we have a strong program in genomics and genetics. We're also linked with our research center, sister center in Lacombe, further north, and also through the University of Alberta, studying things like specified risk materials and prion degradation associated with BSE. A lot of work on feedlot diets and a lot of work on food safety, particularly E. coli, Campylobacter, and Giardia. So, I'd like to think we were successful. I'm biased. I've worked for Ag Canada for 31 years, but I do think we've had a fairly good positive impact on Canadian agriculture. And the reason we've been successful as a department is we've been at it for a long period of time. We've had a fairly significant level of investment. I mean, we could argue more money would be welcome, but in today's environment, I think we're doing pretty well. The breadth of expertise that we have at various, within the whole department is excellent. We do have infrastructure. We have sites located across the country where they need to be. In terms of breeding, we have an excellent repository of germplasm, and lots of organizations do want to collaborate with us, and we wish to collaborate with them as well. In terms of investment, I mentioned we have about $200 million per year is our total budget for research. 20% of that money actually goes into wheat-related research. That's our largest program. We have about 35 professionals. That includes the breeders, the pathologists, and all the other individuals that are working on this. The acronym FTE stands for full-time equivalent. So some scientists may spend half of his or her time on an area, so that would count as half a full-time equivalent. So we have 35 full-time equivalents working on wheat, but we actually have more than 35 people. There's probably closer to 60 scientists that actually work in that program. Our next largest program is in brassicas, mostly in canola, but the newer crops are starting to gain our attention as well. And there our total investment is about $13 million per year. Pulses is another important crop, especially here in Western Canada, where we're looking to maintain the diversity, about $6 million a year. And soybeans, which is primarily an Eastern Canadian crop, we have about $5 million invested. But we are looking we are seeing the increase in soybean acreage coming westward. And in fact, we hired a bean breeder at our Morden site back in, I think it was 2004. He happened to also he came from Arkansas, and he was a soybean breeder there. And there was no accident that we asked him to go to Morden, because we figured as time goes on, soybeans would become more important, and that seems to be the case. You've heard lots of talk about, or you may have heard lots of talk about cutbacks that have happened in the government, but we're still a major player as far as certain areas of research. And plant breeding was one of the areas that was discussed in the last budget. But even if we look at some of the reductions that we've gone through, or will go through by 2013, we still are a major player as far as breeding is concerned. So in terms of cereals, when we take our breeders in Ag Canada, we have 15 compared to the universities, which have 9. There are some areas where we don't have as many as the universities, for example, in brassicas. So the Crop Development Center in Saskatoon has a very good breeding capacity, as well as there's breeding capacity elsewhere. They have more than us. The same is true in pulses. But we actually have more soybean breeders than universities do. There's only one, and that's at the University of Guelph, and we have 2 that are based in Ontario. We've had some pretty positive impacts in terms of our breeding programs. When you look at wheat in particular, we've had midge-tolerant varieties which were recently introduced that have had a have shown very promise in terms of their agronomics as well as their ability to manage the insects. The challenge, of course, associated with mid-tolerant varieties is putting in a plan, an agronomic plan that actually allows us to preserve the resistance. So quite a bit of work has been done on trying to find the balance between what sort of a level of resistant varieties versus susceptible varieties would be needed to maintain that good level of resistance. We are starting to see our germplasm showing more fusarium resistance. In fact, AC Emerson, which was released in 2011, is showing good resistance and expected to make good inroads into Manitoba. We have low cadmium durum wheat, AC Strongfield, which was important in terms of meeting economic or cadmium thresholds in the EU. And I suspect it was more serendipity than anything else, but in our spring wheat, soft white spring wheat varieties, such as AC Andrew, has shown great potential in the bioethanol industry. In terms of cereals, we want to talk about wheat. There's always been some discussion on the rate of gain, genetic gain in terms of wheat hasn't matched what there is in terms of canola. And that's true. I mean, part of that is related to the biology of the crop. But it's also related to the investment that we have from the industry as a whole. That's the government as well as producers as well as the private sector. And it's no secret, the more money you throw at a problem, the more likely it is you're going to find a solution. And so the goal for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is to try and increase some of the level of funding that we have in certain crops. And if we could match the level of investment like we're seeing in canola, just think of the gains we could make in terms of providing producers with good results. So some of the models that we're looking at in terms of trying to increase the investment is there's essentially various pieces of the puzzle that Ag Canada does. We're a large organization. We have different strategies to address different questions. We do public good research. I mean, we're a publicly funded organization, and so part of our mandate is actually to provide answers to larger questions or questions that the private sector would never consider taking on. But there's also other models that we can look at where we've entered into agreements with producer groups, or we can align ourselves with a producer group and in turn try to bring in a private partner where we have some specific outcomes that do have a true market value, or we can provide some sort of basis for upstream type research and then allow the producer and the private organizations to take that forward. So I'll just walk through these examples and just to try and clarify them a little bit. In terms of public good research, things like conservation tillage, a lot of the work that was conducted by Ag Canada early on and continues to be conducted by us has shown great benefits in terms of preserving the environment and soil conservation, moisture conservation. We have those long-term rotation studies that I mentioned that we have at Lethbridge as well as other institutions across the country. We also look at understanding and trying to mitigate greenhouse gases, and also plant breeding for new crops or in niche areas. Canola, for example, which is a great crop, was developed in partnership with Ag Canada and the university back in the 50s. So we're continually searching for that next Cinderella crop. I'm not sure we'll ever find one as magical as canola in my lifetime, but I'm always hopeful. But all of this research that we do is research that the private sector would not necessarily be interested in, but there is definitely a public good for doing that research. When we look at public and producer, the best example that I can think of is our long-term arrangement that we've had with the Western Grains Research Foundation. We have been in collaboration with that organization since 1995, so well over 20 years. No, yeah, not quite 20 years, 15 years. We average about $3 million a year from Western Grains in terms of their investment into our wheat breeding programs and our barley breeding programs. The vast majority goes into wheat. But over the timelines from 1995 to this year, we've had a total of investment about $40 million. And so when you look at the gains, like the wheat midge-tolerant wheat, the increased yield, the AC Strongfield, all of those good innovations have come forward because more money has been put towards research than the government has been able to put at it on its own. When we look at public, producer, private as a possibility, there is, in terms of breeding, for example, we could look for specific outcomes. And here's a case where we would work with an organization to try and develop a public trait that would be of benefit to all. For example, Fusarium head blight or clubroot resistance in canola. If all of those varieties that came forward had that resistance package, that would be a benefit to everyone. With that trait developed, we could transfer the germplasm to the private sector, and they could go ahead and take forward the germplasm and bring it to the marketplace. Our role is not to compete with the private sector. So if we take the example I have here with Canadian Western Hard Red Spring, there is interest right now from the private sector to start to pick up and move those lines forward. Both Bayer and Syngenta have established programs. So there's a case where we might have a fusarium-tolerant variety or resistant variety that we would move over and in collaboration with the private sector, allow them to bring it forward. If we look at soft white spring wheat, for example, that's a low acreage niche type crop. It's unlikely that the private sector would be interested in that particular class of wheat, and those are ones that we would bring forward right through to finishing varieties. And then the final model is looking at where we tend to develop traits, and then essentially we allow the public or the producer or the private sector to bring them forward. And so the trait is developed, say a good example would be, say, canola. Just move all the material over and allow it to go right through an accelerated release program. And so these two models that I've just shown you are somewhat similar. It's just when we hand it over and what we will continue to do over time. But all those possibilities are there. It's not that one size will fit all. We have to find the actual model that works best for everybody. So in summary, I'd just like to close by saying that research is complex. It's changed dramatically over the last 126 years. Research is not something that's done in isolation anymore. It's done in terms of a global setting. And so a lot of the research projects and programs that we enter into no longer exist just in Canada. They have components around the world. A good example is last week we had a delegation of scientists that came from Germany to our center in Winnipeg, and they were there to discuss Fusarium head blight and what can be done in terms of trying to address that challenge. When we look at what's needed to deliver the research, it has to be a collaborative approach. And so that is needed in terms of the human resource capacity that's required, not only the numbers, but the expertise that's out there. If you look at 100 years ago, a breeding program consisted of a scientist doing crosses and bringing the lines forward. That individual may or may not have had some pathology expertise to help the individual, may not have had the entomology or the quality component. Now, of course, the team consists of everything from soup to nuts. It has the entomology, the pathology, the molecular people are looking at markers. We have bioinformaticians that are trying to handle these large data sets. So it's way more complex. The bottom line is, though, that Ag Canada will continue to deliver results for the benefit of Canada and Canadians. How it does it today, though, is quite different than how it did it 126 years ago. So I'd just like to close and say that one thing that when I want to talk about future opportunities just for a second, one thing we're working on is trying to promote these more virtual organizations. And one example is here in Alberta, we have 3 organizations that are very strong in terms of developing or having agricultural research programs. That's ourselves, the province, the universities, and then associated with all of that are the producer organizations. And so if you were to look at Alberta as a whole and see all the capacity that we had in terms of greenhouse facilities, labs, and all of the other infrastructure that's around, and took out the flag, the Canadian flag or the Alberta Ag flag or the University of Alberta flag, it's an impressive set of resources that we have here in the province. And so if we can collectively pull all together and work in a collaborative way, with all of our resources, we can not only increase investment here in Alberta and in Canada, but we can also deliver results to producers and other stakeholders faster and more efficiently. So with that, I'll stop, and I appreciate the time, and thanks for inviting me.